feel free to hit the record. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Welcome, everybody, to the fourth session of the Esoteric Antecedents of Thelema course, and we're going to be talking about skepticism, ancient and Thelemic. So Aleister Crowley is very much influenced by a specific tradition of skepticism that comes from antiquity, specifically Greco-Roman antiquity. And there's a few flavors of this, and they all have certain things in common that we'll be talking about in a moment. And they also have some differences, and I'll have some more to say about that in a minute. Remember that Crowley in the Equinox describes his method as what he calls Pyrrhic Zoroastrianism. People are familiar with that term. It's basically translatable as skeptical theurgy. So the Zoroastrianism that he's referring to are the Magi, who are from Persia, who are practitioners of magic, in other words, theurgy. So he's not actually referring to actual Parsi Zoroastrianism that's still practiced today in India. But the skepticism part of that, Pyrrhonism, is one of these ancient forms of skepticism. And Crowley was also interested in another form of skepticism called academic skepticism that's particularly associated with the writings of Cicero, who we're going to look at in a minute. So there's basically three concepts that ancient skepticism, all these versions of ancient skepticism have in common. And I want to start there, and then there's one other thing I want to say about skepticism before we actually start looking at Cicero and let him kind of explain the subject to us. So three things that ancient skepticism, all these different flavors of it, have basically in common. They're described by three concepts in Greek, and these are the concepts of the epoche, aporia, and ataraxia. And I'll explain what those each mean. So the epoche means to bracket or set aside. And what this is what's called the bracketing of appearances. So rather than just being immersed in everyday experience, where we just assume that what we know about the world is true until we're, for some reason, interrupted in that assumption and have to make some kind of practical reevaluation. The skeptic practices a specifically philosophical methodology where they bracket off the elements of experience and adopt an attitude of questioning towards them, where they suspend the assumption of belief or acquiescence to the truth of appearances, and instead place themselves in an attitude of doubt or skepticism towards the objects of experience. This method continues in modern philosophy, most especially in Edmund Husserl's phenomenology, where the concept of the phenomenological epoche, or bracketing of experience, is one of the primary methodologies that's informing the philosophies of, for example, Martin Heidegger and his analysis of being, and also then all of the French phenomenologists who are interested in Husserl, who then go on to found existentialism, whether that's Jean-Paul Sartre or Merleau-Ponty or any number of other figures. And so they're all influenced by a certain type of skepticism as well. The second concept, aporia. Aporia is a kind of foundational doubt that's the end point of skeptical inquiry. Best example of this is the Platonic dialogues that feature Socrates as a character, where it's not expositing or critiquing somebody else's philosophy. But I'm thinking in particular of like the Euthyphro or some of the earlier, maybe they weren't written earlier, but they're Platonic dialogues that show Socrates kind of as his own character and his own career. And what happens in those dialogues is that somebody who's really sure of themselves comes along and makes some proclamations. And Socrates has this line of questioning where he gradually we would now say deconstructs their argument or shows the fallacies or assumptions involved, that at a certain point, the person who's being questioned by Socrates arrives at an experience of aporia. And this is a Greek word meaning that they're in perplexity. And what's important about this is that it's not just perplexity about particular things, some particular idea or concept, although the line of questioning might have started with that being called into question, but rather this is a kind of doubt that we could call foundationalist. It's a realization that the whole structure of knowledge that we usually move about and conduct our business during the day is not really founded on any kind of absolute, real, sure knowledge, that it's all kind of hearsay at some point or another, more or less practically adopted as a kind of rubric or framework for our experience. And the basic approach of ancient skepticism is that by arriving at aporia through evoque, you then are able to experience a kind of moral value in equanimity. You reach a point where you achieve a kind of tranquility from the fact that you don't ultimately know anything. And then you can kind of relax and not have to be so concerned about the goings on of the world about you. You can achieve a kind of contemplative equanimity. And of course, this is really the goal of most Roman philosophy across the board, whether you're a Stoic or an Epicurean or any of the other kind of varieties of the philosophical paideia or system of rhetorical education that's going on at that time that you might be participating in as a educated member of the Roman civilization. And ataraxia is then the moral goal of skepticism. And so it turns out that ancient skepticism doesn't just practice skepticism for its own sake. And in that sense, it's a little bit different than later modern forms of philosophy that see themselves as sort of purely detached and scientific, and that they're just trying to be language referees or come in like Bertrand Russell and use logic as a way to adjudicate the meaning of certain propositions or whatever. And they're not, if they're bettering themselves as human beings, that's a kind of byproduct, but it's not a direct, it's not the direct goal of philosophy. They're supposed to be cooler and more disinterested, I guess. Logical positivism is maybe the main exemplar of this kind of attitude. And the Ludwig Wittgenstein at certain points of his career was kind of promoting this attitude. But it's a little bit false to ancient skepticism, which is very much a moral philosophy. And that leads me to my next point, which is that as a methodology, skepticism is never pure. It always has an agenda. And this agenda can often be quite conservative. In other words, the point of achieving ataraxia is that you can then set aside skeptical doubts about traditional knowledge and culture and just be a good citizen, basically, and go about your business. And in the context of ancient life, this is in many ways kind of the goal of philosophy. And it's only really in modern experience where we live in a technologically advancing society where we experience ourselves in a different kind of very fundamentally different relationship to culture and nature, where these are all transformable by human activity because we've come to recognize them as the products of human activity. And so from that standpoint, there's a basically kind of techno-gnostic perspective on reality where we take on, as human beings, the divine role of governance of the cosmos and try to remake it in terms of our projects and objectives, whether that's sending rockets to Mars or whatever or different forms of social engineering, otherwise called either socialism or capitalism or whatever you want to define them as, larger political projects that are global in scope and involve all this engineering of what's happening, this enormous social political infrastructure that we all move, live, and have our being in as modern subjects. And none of that is really part of ancient societies because they didn't experience their social conditions as malleable. Tacitus, at the beginning of his histories, or is it the Annals? I can't remember. Says that his conclusion as to why the Roman Republic became an empire is that it was fated by the gods that one person should rule the world, and so that's what happened. There's a kind of fatalism, and skepticism, ancient skepticism in particular, is a kind of fatalistic philosophy. And we need to keep that in mind because Thelemic skepticism is more a kind of modern philosophy that is not fatalistic. In fact, it's decisionistic. It's about being responsible for our human action in the world and this Gnostic quest for the true will, which is a kind of categorical imperative that we impose on ourselves that organizes our experience, that motivates us to do things. And I'm not, of course, claiming that there aren't quietist moments within or within that larger trajectory. But it is a kind of philosophy of life that's meant to overcome certain very specific conditions of modern experience, which we might call alienation, where traditional embedded forms of social life have been disrupted by modern technological capitalism, and we're all unmoored from any kind of traditional system of knowing or life. And so unlike ancient skeptics who wanted to calm their unruly emotional instincts so as to kind of just be in the flow of life in feudal agrarian society, which was believed to be unsurpassable, we're in a very different eonic situation where we're under conditions of apocalyptic transformation of our society that we're called upon by that horizon of experience to participate in, perhaps in a more activist manner, either individually as well as in solidarity with other things that are going on around us. So what I want to emphasize then is this ambiguity of skepticism by whomever. And what I mean by that is to insist on a kind of priority of hermeneutics over skepticism. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that hermeneutics, which is the philosophy of interpretation, how do human beings interpret things, cognitively and linguistically. And how we do that is that when we always have a particular hermeneutical prehension or pre-having to our understanding. There's always a certain context of understanding within which we then understand things. Martin Heidegger's way of putting this is to say, when we see a tree, for us to be able to know that it's a tree, we already have to know what a tree is. And this goes for the whole set of linguistic usages that we are socialized into to become speaking subjects when we're children, and then we forget or just go with the flow of that process. And rather than understanding how culturally arbitrary this is, we just assume that that's the way the world is. And we all do this to some extent or another. We're all absorbed into this. And of course, most of the time, for most people going about their daily lives, this is just fine. There's nothing inherently necessarily wrong with that at all times. It's just that if we're doing that all the time and we're not open to the way that a certain skepticism can open us up to alternatives to what we're doing, we can get stuck in certain grooves that become very counterproductive. Because the social system of references that we've inherited is not without its ideological ambiguities, whether that's assumptions of patriarchy, the kind of mythology of race that all of us as colonial subjects, whether we're white or black or whatever, are completely immersed in and hypnotized by and ideologically interpenetrated by. And so we have to be very alert to that to be able to maneuver around the pitfalls that come from these types of inherited ideologies that are always being structurally reinforced around us. And so certain magical skepticism becomes a powerful tool to find the course of our true will to maneuver skillfully through these kinds of the obstacle course of modern life, rather than stumble our way through it, like Don Knotts in some 70s Disney comedy where, we're tripping over ourselves in every other scene. And that might be amusing, but in real life, that could be quite awkward. And so if part of the goal of Magick is to become a suavely skillful artist of our own life, then if it's not too pretentious to put it that way, to find a way to live a life of honor, dignity, and complex creative richness under modern conditions of life that can make that difficult to achieve, then a certain type of magical skepticism is a tool to that. But all of that, for all that I just talked about to be the case, we have to have all of these prehensions. We have to have all of these hermeneutical pre-havings and assumptions that are basically in place, and that we're not also being skeptical about those, or we've been skeptical to discriminate to get to the point where we decide that these are what we're about. And then, or to put it in other ways, Ludwig Wittgenstein says at a certain point, explanations come to an end. What he means by that is at a certain point, you make up your mind that you're either going to do or think something, and then you are following through with that in praxis. And so skepticism itself doesn't tell you what that is. It's a kind of formalism, but it can be a tool to get to that, to discriminate that kind of substratum. So I guess what I'm saying is that the assumptions that skeptics have need to themselves be subject to skepticism. And the naive or obnoxious kinds of skepticism that one can encounter, I find this is often the case in conservative politics right now, is people who are superficially practicing a kind of skepticism towards people whose opinions they don't like, but are not themselves cognizant of their own biases. And I think it's just fine to have biases. It just depends on what they are. There are good biases to have. To be for the good in some pragmatic sense that makes sense and, coherently in civic society to wanting well for other people, that's a biases, but it's a good one. I have that. I hope other people do. Again, the point is not to not have pre-assumptions. The point of philosophical skepticism, or the kind of magical skepticism I'm talking about today, is simply to become gnostically aware of what those are, to become intelligently skillful about that, and not to be some dumb bigot who shows up and is like, hey, I'm being skeptical about other people's political opinions, but I'm not going to question the fact that I think immigrants are some blankety blank or whatever is the particular prejudice that they think is rational when it's not. And that can be uncovered in moments through some kind of basic skepticism about what they're talking about. But, if they're going to pull the brain in the vat maneuver, where they're like, but how do we know anything when you question them? That's just lazy. We shouldn't be, we should be skeptical about that kind of skepticism, is what I'm arguing. Okay, let's take a look at Cicero. Let me share my screen, and then I always have to back up here just a moment. Hang on a sec. Sorry, this is just taking me a moment longer. It's not wanting to come up. Here we go. Okay, now everybody can see it. Okay, Joseph, if you would care to read this first paragraph for us, if you'd like to do that, please. If not, that's fine, but go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I'm just moving to a quieter place.
Yeah, please.
There are many questions in philosophy to which no satisfactory answer has yet been given. But the question of the nature of the gods is the darkest and most difficult of all. An answer to this question could shed the clearest light upon the nature of our own minds and also give to the essential guidance which we need in our religion. So various and so contradictory are the opinions of the most learned men on this matter as to persuade one of the truth of the saying that philosophy is the child of ignorance, and that the philosophers of the academy have been wise in withholding their consent from any proposition that has not been proved.
Okay, there's the basic principle of skepticism. Go ahead and finish the paragraph, and then I'll back up and explain that.
There is nothing worse than a hasty judgment, and nothing could be more unworthy of the dignity and integrity of a philosopher than uncritically to adopt a false opinion or to maintain a certain some theory which has not been fully explored and understood.
Okay, and here's the agenda of so-called academic skepticism, which is to withhold consent from any proposition that has not been proved. Now, of course, it's going to turn out that no proposition is ultimately provable. So you're ultimately withholding your consent from what's called dogmatism, which is to think that you can know things for sure. And because that's considered to be arrogant. That's considered to be a kind of hubris, which is a sign of bad character. So the person of good character is supposed to behave in a piously restrained way and not go around claiming that they know things for sure, but instead asserting only what seems to be probable and to be non-dogmatic about that. And this is a criterion of what's called fallibilism, and it's introduced into academic skepticism by a particular philosophy called Carneades. There will be no test on this. I'm just mentioning this as the lineage of ideas that Cicero is part of, because Cicero is an adherent of the version of ancient skepticism called academic skepticism, and he's an upholder of the position of Carneades that we should appeal to a kind of pragmatic common sense to make decisions, but we shouldn't claim certainty about our opinions. Instead, we should hold to what seems probable and base our actions on that, but it's arrogant to be too sure of yourself. And so skepticism is a kind of moral medicine to that, to prevent you from doing that. Hang on a second, I'm looking for some notes that I made earlier. They're going to tell me what I'm going to look at next in this text. And for some reason now I can't find them, so that's okay. Let's move on to the next to the next page. And Lana, if you could read the paragraph that starts, "There are and always have been."
Okay. Wait, which one there? What? Say it again. Which paragraph?
It's on the left-hand page on your screen.
On the
And
bottom?
it's just a little bit down from the top on that left-hand page where it says, "There are and always have been some
I see it.
philosophers."
I see it.
Yes.
There are and always have been some philosophers who believe that the gods have no concern whatever with the affairs of men. But if this belief is true, what becomes of piety, of reverence, and of religion? All the tributes of purity and chastity which men offer to the divinity of the gods are meaningless if the gods are unaware of them, and if in their immortal existence they're oblivious of the human race. If the gods cannot help us, and would not if they could, but care nothing about us, and do not even notice what we do, if in short these immortal beings exert no influence whatever on human affairs, then why should we revere them, honor them, or pray to them? Piety, like any other virtue, cannot long endure in the guise of a mere convention and pretense. When piety goes, religion and sanctity go with it. And when these are gone, there is anarchy, and complete confusion in our way of life. Indeed, I do not know whether, if our reverence for the gods were lost, we should not also see the end of good faith, of human brotherhood, and even of justice itself, which is the keystone of all the virtues.
Okay, thanks. So what Cicero is doing in this paragraph is that he's telling us what his hermeneutical prehensions are in terms of what his agenda is as a skeptic. So what he's going to argue in the rest of this book is that all the arguments that philosophers present for why gods exist or don't exist are confusing regular normal people who need to be taught to be good citizens by religion. And so philosophy is safe for educated people like him, like Cicero, but we should be careful when teaching it to regular people on the street, because it might disrupt them and make them immoral, because they'll start questioning things. And really, from Cicero's point of view, the most important thing about religion is that it keeps the masses in line. He's, of course, a Roman senator, and so he's concerned with statecraft as the kind of basis for piety. The point that I'm making here is that one of the things this text reveals that I think is kind of interesting is that for people in ancient times, they were aware that their mythologies were kind of preposterous, that they were fictional, that they were not to be taken literally, especially educated people. And there's a lot of skepticism among the ruling classes towards religion. Cicero has a whole other book on divination that he writes, where basically he says it's bogus. It doesn't tell you anything. It's totally ambiguous. It's just based on however you choose to interpret it. It doesn't really matter. But it's very important that we piously practice it all the time. And all the sacrificial rites of the state need to be carefully observed, because otherwise we won't be promoting piety, and then the state will fall apart. And so we can't do that. And so that's why religion is true. And that's why we should say that it's true. And that's why we should, quote unquote, believe that it's true. And basically that's Cicero's argument in this book. Now, I think that's very interesting, because he's very open about, and this is why I find this text very interesting, is because he tells you what his reasons are, and they're very frank. And we would perhaps even today say cynical and manipulative. But he feels that this is his duty as a member of the ruling class to uphold religion. And that's the reason that he believes in the gods. Not because philosophy tells him to believe or not to believe in the gods, but because as a pious senator, he's inherited these traditions from his ancestors, and it's his public duty to uphold them. And that's it. That's the reason he believes in the gods, and that's why people should believe in them. So let me now move forward a little bit, and let's take a look at what he says about, let's see what he says about skepticism. Victoria, if you're willing to, could you please read the paragraph that starts, "We who philosophize by this method"? It's okay if you don't want to. We can go, oh, I've got someone. Okay, Robert, if you could read that paragraph. Starting, "We who philosophize by this method." If Robert is able to do that. If not, Luke, if you could please read the paragraph that says, "We who philosophize by this method."
Yeah. We who philosophize by this method are not just chasing shadows. I have dealt more fully and more generally with this point elsewhere, but as some persons persist in this unteachable stupidity, I have to keep on ramming it home. We of the Academy are not people who will accept nothing as true, but we do hold that every true perception has in it an admixture of falsehood so similar to the truth that we have no certain criterion of judgment and assent. It follows that we can attain only to a number of probable truths, which, although they cannot be proved as certainties, yet may appear so clear and convincing that a wise man may well adopt them as a rule of life.
Okay, thank you. So this is our basic procedure for academic skepticism. And it's based, again, on the fallibilistic premise that although we can't have certain knowledge, we can have probable knowledge, and therefore we should follow that procedure. So it's a kind of anti-foundationalist philosophy. And on this point, Crowley and Cicero are going to concur, which is that for Thelemic skepticism, just as with academic skepticism, there's a openness to the kind of anti-foundationalism, the idea that the whole procedure of finding metaphysical or absolute foundations for knowledge is a false and pointless procedure. And this, in a way, is an alternative to the kind of Platonism that we were looking at last week, where Plato's, if you remember, Aristotle says of Plato that he accepted Heraclitus's conclusion that sense knowledge, you were coming through there, Robert, just a moment ago, that sense experience is fallible and therefore cannot be the basis of proof of knowledge. And so Plato's response to that was to posit truth in another world, to say that there was a spiritual, supernatural, metaphysical realm of forms, and that it was in virtue of some kind of participation in that realm that appearances can be said to be true or false, and that our own rationality also participates in the realm of forms, and therefore we're able to have knowledge in that way. So academic skepticism represents a kind of doubt towards that knowing, but that doesn't mean that it's rejecting a spiritual relationship with the domain of experience that's called the divine, or what Cicero calls the gods. It's just that It wants to retain, it doesn't want to be dogmatic about that. So it's a way to practice spirituality non-dogmatically. And Crowley's interested in that because it allows him to oppose the kind of dogmatism that's part of Christian dogmatism, the foundationalist attitude of Christianity that it derives from Platonism. And so that's why this type of ancient skepticism represents an alternative for Crowley. So let's actually look at that now. Let's see. I'm going to just for a moment stop sharing the screen so that I can now pull up The Soldier and the Hunchback. Oh, yes, here we go. Great. And then let's, whoops, didn't do it. Let's try that again. I know how to do it now. Yes, there it is. Slowly figuring this out. Okay, now, Robert, if you're able to unmute and read us where it says inquiry.
Inquiry. Let us inquire in the first place. What is skepticism? The word means looking, questioning, investigating. One must pass contemptuously the Christian liar's gloss, which interprets skeptic as mocker. Though in a sense it is true for him, since to inquire into Christianity is assuredly to mock at it, but I am concerned to intensify the etymological connotation in several respects. First, I do not regard mere incredulity as necessary to the idea, though credulity is incompatible with it. Incredulity implies a prejudice in favor of a negative conclusion, and the true skeptic should be perfectly unbiased.
Keep going a bit further.
Secondly, I exclude vital skepticism. What's the good of anything expects, as we used to learn about none? The answer, why not think? And again, is prejudice. Indolence is no virtue in a questioner.
Okay, there we go.
Okay.
Let's pause there and let's read just one more bit where he says, Taryn, if you could read where it says, I picture the true skeptic as a man eager and alert, and I'll tell you when to stop.
I picture the true skeptic as a man eager and alert, his deep eyes glittering like sharp swords, his hands tense with effort as he asks, what does it matter? I picture the false skeptic as a dude or popinjay yawning, with dull eyes, his muscles limp, his purpose in asking the question, but the expression of his slackness and stupidity.
Okay, pause there. So what's going on here is that for Crowley, the really important philosophical insight that is disclosed by the skeptical method is not the abstract and obvious triviality that it's always possible to find some reason to doubt any assertion. Rather, what's important about that procedure is that it leads him to anti-foundationalist conclusions. So in other words, the problem with skepticism, or rather, the problem with skepticism is not that anything goes. Only the lazy skeptic waste their time with this kind of claim, the how do we know anything kind of attitude. Rather, the genuine skeptic really wants to know. They're interested in what the philosopher Alain Badiou calls a truth procedure. Truth matters. Skepticism should be about finding out what the truth is, and we should be genuinely interested in that. The issue that skepticism raises, that's a kind of important methodological point, is that since every answer leads to more questions and so on and so forth in an infinite regress, this logical feature of all semiotic inquiry leads Crowley to the awareness that the whole linguistic cognitive system of any possible inquiry is ultimately ungrounded foundationless and lacks any means to establish the absolute and a priori truth of any assertion. In other words, the conclusion to be drawn from this is that truth can't be formally established. It has to be practically presupposed. And then it's either supported or refuted by experience. And so that shifts us away from metaphysical foundationalism into a kind of pragmatic methodology. So the whole point of this is to shift us away from the type of dogmatism that Osirian Ionic systems of enslaving human beings ideologically, like Christianity, are fixated on metaphysical certainty. And what Crowley is trying to do is he's trying to use skepticism to blow up that whole set of assumptions, that whole need to do that, and to instead shift the whole basis of what we're inquiring into over to a kind of practical or pragmatic approach in which illumination becomes a search for the adequate, the contextually and historically adequate set of presuppositions that we know are not ultimately provable, but which we adopt out of will to power, out of our own creative human groundless and yet nevertheless magically assertive will to mold our circumstances in accord with will into a magically enlightened circumstance. Anyway, let me switch again over to what Crowley has to say about that, and let's see. So this is now, we're going to skip forward to section 6. There's a lot of interesting arguments in the middle of this essay, which it would be wonderful for us to have more time to look at, but we don't have time. So let me just skip ahead and then let me share the screen. And then, great. So then who hasn't talked for a bit? Joseph, if you could jump in again. You went first. Let's have you go again. Could you read a bit where it says, suppose then we accept our skepticism?
Suppose then we accept our skepticism as having destroyed our knowledge, root and branch. Is there no limit to its action? Does it not, in a sense, stultify itself? Having destroyed logic by logic, if Satan cast out Satan, how shall his kingdom stand? Let us stand on the mount, saviors of the world that we are, and answer, get thee behind me, Satan, though refraining from quoting texts or giving reasons. Oh ho, says somebody, is Aleister Crowley here? Samson blinded and bound, grinding corn for the Philistines. Not at all, dear boy. We shall put all the questions that we can put, but we may find a tower built upon a rock against which the winds beat in vain. Not what the Christians call faith, be sure, but what possibly the forgers of the epistles, those eminent mystics, meant by faith. What I call samadhi, and as faith with...
Okay, let's have Lana now read the next page. With faith without works is dead. Lana, are you there?
Sorry,
Okay,
sorry,
cool.
I forgot to unmute. Okay,
Not a
so I
problem.
don't see the top. Okay, what I call samadhi, and as faith without works is dead. So, good friends, samadhi is all humbug unless the practitioner shows the glint of its gold in his work in the world. If your mystic becomes Dante, well, if Tennyson a fig for his trances. But how does this tower of samadhi stand the assault of question time? Is not the idea of samadhi just dependent on all the other ideas? Man, time, being, thought, logic? If I seek to explain samadhi by analogy, am I not often found talking as if we knew all about evolution and mathematics and history? complex and unscientific studies, mere straws before the blast of our hunchback friend.
The hunchback is the question mark, is the
Yeah.
question of skepticism.
Well, one of the buttresses is just a small matter of common sense.
Okay, and now there's the appeal to common sense. So this is actually important. And this maneuver doesn't come out of nowhere. It is, in fact, David Hume's antidote to his own corrosive deployment of skepticism in his work, An Inquiry Concerning the Human Understanding, where he calls, for example, our belief in causality into doubt, or the idea that we have a cohesive self. He presents a bunch of skepticism about that in this work. Now, Crowley is particularly interested in Hume's skepticism. In fact, in a way, I think it's arguable that Aleister Crowley is primarily a Humean skeptic in terms of how he adopts and uses ancient skeptical ideas, that he's interested in the way that kind of moves through Hume's thought into his own education. And basically, Hume's antidote to skepticism is common sense. He appeals to a kind of pragmatic human understanding of the world as the basis for our judgments, as opposed to any kind of metaphysical speculation. And in fact, this is something like the general view of what we might call the common sense school of philosophy, associated with something that more contemporary scholarship calls the Scottish Enlightenment. And this is the flowering of academic and cultural thought going on in bourgeois Scottish, particularly academic circles in the later 18th century. And David Hume is the outstanding figure in that movement, but it includes any number of other interesting figures. And although there's a lot of things they have that make them different, they share a number of things in common. And one of those things is an interest in ancient skepticism, and also a common sense that the upshot of ancient skepticism that could be useful for modern philosophy is the idea that instead of using some kind of metaphysical or foundationalist procedure for establishing truth, quote unquote, with a capital T, that the more important, useful way of proceeding with philosophy is to instead appeal to common sense, and then the empirical proof or disproof within experience of common sense. The Scottish Enlightenment is mostly in the late 18th centuries, late 1700s. The age of Johnson and Boswell. That's when Hume is writing. And so, in other words, the solution to general skepticism is to abandon the methodology of searching for general proofs in favor of a pragmatic empiricism supported by scientific rationalism. So Crowley thinks that such an empiricism would, in principle, have no difficulty acknowledging the experience of samadhi, so that, as Crowley succinctly puts it, I keep my skepticism intact and I keep my samadhi intact. So in other words, mysticism and magic becomes something that's being scientifically investigated, but not from a foundationalist or metaphysical point of view. We're not trying to prove what ultimate reality is. Rather, we're addressing the fact that magic pragmatically works. When you practically perform these exercises, you get certain results. And then we're then evaluating those results within the practical context of our experience. And we're not simply moving from that to more general metaphysical statements. We're keeping it within this more practical domain of common sense, where the question is, how does this magical practice gnostically inform my personal true will and my immediate historical context in terms of what information that can give me about how I need to respond to that, rather than saying, oh, I know what the truth with a capital T is, and I'm going to proclaim that and punish people who don't agree with me because they're wicked, because I must be good, because I know what the truth is, which is the Christian Osirian Aeonic perspective. And Crowley's trying to move out of that into a more pluralistic, diverse, cosmopolitan, modern context where that's not the agenda. And there needs to be some other better agenda. And this is kind of what he's proposing for that. Okay, so let's look back again at the soldier and the hunchback. Moving forward a little bit to, what's the next bit I'm looking at? Hang on a sec, let me find it. Okay, good. Screen. Okay. Luke, would you be willing to read where it says, this sounds in a way like the interior certainty?
This sounds in a way like the interior certainty of the common or garden Christian, but there are differences. The Christian insists on notorious lies being accepted as an essential part of his, more usually her, system. I, on the contrary, ask for facts, for observation. Under skepticism, true, one is just as much a house of cards as the other, but only in the philosophical sense. Practically, science is true, and faith is foolish. Practically, 3 times 1 equals 3 is the truth, and 3 times 1 equals 1 is a lie, though skeptically, both statements may be false or unintelligible. Practically, Franklin's method of obtaining fire from heaven is better than that of Prometheus or Elijah. I am now writing by the light that Franklin's discovery enabled men to use.
Okay, pause there. Robert, if you could pick up from there.
Practically, I concentrated my mind upon a white radiant triangle in whose center was a shining eye. For 22 minutes and 10 seconds, my intention wandering 45 times is a scientific and valuable statement. I prayed fervently to the Lord for the space of many days. Means anything or nothing. Anybody who cares to do so may imitate my experiment and compare his result with mine. In the latter case, one would always be wondering what fervently meant and who the Lord was and how many days, you jumped there, and how many days means anything or nothing. Anybody who cares to do so, I already read that, sorry, may do so, may imitate my experiment and compare result with mine. In the latter case, one would always be wondering what fervently meant and who the Lord was and how many days made many.
Okay, thanks. Taryn, if you could pick up from there. My claim 2.
My claim, too, is more modest than the Christians. She knows more about my future than is altogether pleasant. I claim nothing absolute from my samadhi. I know only too well the worthlessness of single-handed observations, even on so simple a matter as a boiling point determination. And as for his, usually her, future, I content myself with mere common sense about the probable end of a fool. So that after all, I keep my skepticism intact, and I keep my samadhi intact. The one balances the other. I care nothing for the vulgar brawling of these two varlets of my mind.
Okay, thank you. So that's basically the point. This is about the methodology of magical practice. It's about the framing of the aspirational effort of the attitude that the magician should have towards their practice. And it follows the 3 basic principles of ancient skepticism, namely epoche, aporia, and ataraxia. So there's a kind of epoche, there's a bracketing of magical experience where we approach it from a scientific method, meaning in the example that Crowley gives, I concentrated my mind upon a radiant white triangle in whose center was a shining eye for 22 minutes and 10 seconds, and then there were 45 breaks. Okay, he says that's a scientific and valuable statement. So rather than saying, you know, any number of theosophical claims about the astral plane, about what's happening when I use my imagination, and then the causal, you know, the interactions of the, you know, the secret master Kut Humi, who is, lives in somewhere in the mountains in Tibet, but they're astrally projecting themselves to be in telepathic communication with me because, according to Paul Foster Case, I have these Ritalin crystals that have solidified in my pituitary gland because of the Kundalini energy I've made shoot up my spine because of the tarot cards that I'm looking at. And that is a radio transmitter on the etheric that allows me to communicate with the secret masters. And we don't need any of that. That's all subjected to the epoche, to the bracketing. And instead, what we do is we concentrate on the exercise and the procedure that we're following for that exercise, and then we see what happens, and then we draw practical conclusions from the information that we gain from that. And part of the basis for this is a kind of aporia, where we have a kind of methodological skepticism towards ultimate truth claims. And this protects us from fanaticism and from fundamentalism, and keeps Thelema from turning into crypto-Christianity again, which is always a danger when we're part of, particularly in the United States, we're very much still part of a kind of Puritan Christian culture that is very obsessed with dogmatically knowing what the truth is and punishing those who don't. And that gets racialized and genderized and is infused with patriarchy and colonial settler values. And it's a big mess of stinking garbage. And there's a kind of clarity that can come through introducing a little bit of skepticism into the kind of assurances that liberal identity politics promises its adherents. And instead, if we could cast a cold, cool eye on life, as W.B. Yeats says in one of his poems, I hope I quoted that right, and just get a little bit more distance, not to disengage, but to have the coolness of clarity to be able to know when and how to engage with what's going on. And that can certainly be political, but we have to, there's too much noise, there's too much static on all channels right now. And so having a skeptical methodology allows us to kind of cultivate ataraxia instead, a kind of tranquil equanimity, which then gives us the kind of stoic coolness with which we can, I think, ultimately be engaged ethically more effectively. And that certainly relates to the problem of the true will as a social problem in terms of how we're, what we're gaining from our gnosis as magicians in terms of how we should then orient ourselves towards the larger social project of the eon itself as a kind of apocalyptic crisis where human freedom is at stake. But what does that mean? And if we're not approaching this foundationally, that becomes a practical question rather than a question of just assuming that we already know what truth and freedom are, and then we just charge in, you know, hacking about with our baseball bat or whatever. Sometimes it's good to just take a step back and try to achieve some ataraxia. And maybe it'll be when it's time to then be more emotionally engaged. And I'm certainly in favor of ecstatic engagement with our creative projects. And at that point, we can let go of ataraxia and be more, have more force and fire, as it were. But that needs to be refined. We need to know when and where it's appropriate to act. And so having this type of skepticism, I think, is a valuable tool to achieve that. Anyway, it's a little after 3, so my usual procedure is to talk for an hour and then to open a Q&A, comment, discussion, and see if we can spend the last half hour having a discussion about these ideas. So I want to open the floor, and if anybody has anything they want to say, just jump in and make a contribution. Questions, comments.
Yeah, hi.
Joseph, go ahead.
Yeah, so you mentioned that you encourage people to kind of seek the good at the beginning of this lecture. It seems like to me that, Crowley and Thelema are very much in the tradition of the Nietzschean tradition of like beyond good and evil. I mean, you look at, and then you mentioned Satan a few times in this essay, or you look in the 3rd chapter, Book of the Law. There's kind of it's almost more just like the procedures, the practices that he's advocating. And there doesn't seem to be a morality, I guess, and more just, like you said, the pragmatic.
Well, but that pragmatic approach is a kind of morality, but it's a morality that's beyond good and evil. But when Nietzsche says that, what he means is beyond good and evil in a metaphysical sense. He doesn't mean beyond good and evil in the sense that might be posited by will to power. In other words, if there is only will to power, then there are only values. It's just that those values are historically diverse and contextual. In other words, William James has an interesting way of putting this. He says that rather than thinking of reality as being a universe, we should think of it instead as a pluriverse. And that pluriverse is beyond good and evil in the sense that it cannot be unified or totalized around a single axis of values, because all values are historically contextual. But then it becomes all the more urgent to seek those values that would be appropriate for our particular context. So to put that another way, when I say that we should seek the good, what I'm really acknowledging there is that we all seek some form of the good, but that's diverse depending on our unique perspective. So all of us, from a Thelemic point of view, we're all like unique and conqueror. We're all these, every point event in reality has its own will to power, its own perspectivist agenda.
Mm-hmm.
And then that has to be coordinated then in that, because we all also form the company of heaven. We're all this kind of constellation of all of these points of views, this kind of anarchy of being that doesn't have its agenda preset by some kind of ultimate platonic horizon of being. We've let go of that, but we still have projects that we have in common. There's still an eon where there's a constellation formed of these unique point of views. And so I think what is really being kind of advocated in the 3rd chapter of the Book of Law and so forth is that there's going to be a kind of we're going to have to fight it out amongst each other. We're going to have to learn to cooperate with each other within the anarchy of being to posit common social goals, where we can't rely on these being set for us by some pre-established harmonic organic hierarchy of being. That Assyrian dream that could be discriminated or obeyed, that we could be the wonderful slaves of some all-knowing God that would tell us what to do. We give up on that, but what we get in exchange is the human freedom to figure out how to cooperate with each other in common projects within a kind of practical life world. And that certainly is to seek the good, but it's to seek the good in a pluriverse rather than a universe. And I think that still is an agenda of Thelemic magic. So when we talk about what Nietzsche means when he says that the philosopher is beyond good and evil, that's within the context of a kind of critique of Christian metaphysics, where Nietzsche is still all about the urgency for human beings to posit new values that are appropriate for modern, pluralistic, cosmopolitan, diverse social experience. It's just that he wants us to own that positive values as our positive values, rather than claiming that there's some other world that we're in service to that's telling us what the truth with a capital T is. Is that?
So
I
I
mean-
understand you're saying like the good is the will to power, and
Yes.
and then the
That is a good.
the harmony of diverse wills.
Not necessarily the harmony inside. Any kind of harmonization has to be local, not falsely universalized. It's a kind of coherent cohesion that emerges spontaneously from the bottom up out of the anarchy of being, rather than being imposed top down from some kind of organic hierarchical order of truth. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
It's just it's a paradigm shift, and it's still a
Yeah.
formalism. It doesn't tell us what to do, but it tells us the context within which we should think about what we should be doing. And that for me is what Thelema does as a philosophy. It's a kind of formalism that we have to fill in pragmatically. When it says seek the true will, it doesn't tell me what my true will is. I still have to do that, but it tells me that that's something that I should be seeking.
Mhm. Yeah, that's the morality, is that you should seek your true will.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the morality. It doesn't tell us what the good is. It tells us that we should seek some good, but then it leaves that up to us, because that's all it can do, because this is about freedom. And so if it's about freedom, then we're the ones who have to figure that out interpersonally, each new day as we're getting together with the projects that we're trying to accomplish. Basically, I take this as, for both Crowley and Nietzsche, what they're saying is don't wait around for some ultimate truth to come along that you can enslave yourself to, whether that's the Christian God or the Soviet Union, as the truth of whatever, or some other totalitarian political project, or no one's going to show up and be the big father daddy who's got, Papa Stalin or Jesus Christ who's going to save you. We have to save ourselves. And so we should get on with that in a practical way. And then this interesting ability that we have as human beings to do magic, that might be really useful in doing that. Maybe we should look at that and see if we can engage in these types of spiritual exercises and magical practices together in a kind of community that we can form to do that we can maybe accomplish some of our goals with. That's what I think is, to me, kind of the bottom line. I mean, there's obviously more to be said, but to me, that's the bottom line. And that's how I would answer your question, which is that I accept perspectivism, but I don't see that as in any way negative. I don't see that as saying that we shouldn't have values. It's saying that we need to own that we're the ones who make those values and make them valid. Which again is a reference to Nietzsche's will to power.
Yeah.
Anyway, does somebody else have a question or want to make a comment? Anything at all on this topic or anything else about what we've been talking about? Luke, go ahead.
Yeah, so just because I was reading that one section, made me think about how Crowley does go pretty like against the Christian in a almost polemic way, and it seems like there's an undertone of some set assumptions that he has, or that he's expecting of the reader, also with the in parentheses, more like women because I think that's also kind of, that has an undertone of maybe from his time, more like
He's thinking of
sometimes
women
see
who
him.
are evangelicals who distribute tracts and tract societies. There's a character in Wilkie Collins' The Moonstone, which is his favorite novel of Crowley's. That's a kind of comedic character who's this older woman who, this is all also a kind of sexist stereotype. So just, take that for what it is. And she's this busybody but she knows what the truth is because she believes in Jesus, and she has these awful tracts that she's written about the truth, and she's always handing them out to people at tea. And this is what Crowley is alluding to, and it's meant as a kind of, it's meant to be funny. It's meant as a joke about when he's talking about Christians, he's picking out different social types that would be familiar to other Victorians. These are the annoying people that I'm referring to.
Yeah, so that does change, like in context of.
Yes, he's thinking of like
nowadays.
this character in the Wilkie Collins novel, or this kind of stereotype of the boring and bigoted and contentious evangelical who's always trying to shove some tract that they've written that they think is the, sliced cheese when you're trying to have tea. And they're everywhere and you can't get away from them. And again, when he's talking about Victorian, the kind of Christianity that he's always referring to in this pejorative way is British Victorian colonial imperial Christianity. So it's the British Empire as a colonial imperialist Christian project where they're the best and they know everything and they're the truth and their civilization, and they're these bigoted idiots, all of them. And that's what Crowley is mad at, and what he wants to contextually within his own historical moment, he wants to create an alternative to. And I think that's still a useful stereotype when that's compared to certain types of, the parallel to that in our own experience would be Christian nationalism. And also, to be quite frank, fascism. Because fascism, which is usually, I think, incorrectly treated as a secular movement, in fact, it emerges out of right-wing Christianity in the 1920s and 30s. And I think that's particularly obvious, maybe more in Italy than in Germany, where in Italy, it's very much coming out of the Catholic anti-communist populist movement, and is definitely Christian. And certainly that's also the case in Germany, but there's a kind of superficial tendency in German Nazism to not directly refer to Christianity. And the only real contextual reason for that is not that they aren't appealing to Christian conservatives, it's that they don't want to get caught up in confessional differences between Catholics and Protestants, because Germany is split between these two different confessional communities. And they don't want to get drawn into that. And so unlike in Italy, where they can count on everybody Christian also being Catholic, they can't count on that in Germany. And so they have to have this more sort of generalized fascism. Does that make sense? And but it's still deeply based on rural Christian bigotry and the desire for the German Empire that was crushed at the end of the First World War to come back. If we could just have that back, where we could have Aryan supremacy with the good Christian people in the villages, and all this chaos in the urban areas with these, educated Jews going around, telling us that we're superstitious and, all our nonsense, and we don't like those kinds of people. And could we just have some big father figure come along and take care of things for us? And so that type of fascism and Christianity together is what Crowley's pushing back on. When he first arrived in Italy in 1920, the Mussolini's fascists were taking over, and very early on, as many people did, Crowley thought, well, maybe these are like noble rural rebels who are like trying to achieve some kind of authentic existence against the problems of urban life. And very quickly Crowley realized, nope, it's Christian bigots and I need to be against it. And he was anti-fascist after that. And then of course they kicked him out of Italy. And Marco Passi has done some interesting research on this in his really great book on Crowley's politics, particularly in the era of fascism. It's called Aleister Crowley and the Temptation of Politics. It's a great book. And it's about how Crowley was trying to position himself as Antifa basically in the 30s. And it was based on a recognition that fascism was a basically Christian Osirian oppressive enslaving political project. And I think that continues today in Christian nationalism, either in the United States or elsewhere, and also in Russian fascism. And there's Putinism. There's other movements that are afloat right now. And I think Thelema has a lot to say to oppose those kinds of movements. And some of the skeptical methodology that we've been talking about today is part of its contribution to these movements that all have this kind of authoritarian absolutism where they're always asserting that they're the people who know what the truth is. And there's these other group of people that they need to be down on to attack. And I think part of the advantage of a more pragmatic view of seeking the good socially is to recognize that there are diverse perspectives on what the good is. And that what we should be looking for is a way to democratically coordinate in a larger conversation these views so that we can find practical compromises and relationships that allow us all to kind of try to get along and get what we want done. And the moment somebody comes along and says, I've got the truth with a capital T, and having that truth means that I'm good, because being good means that you have the truth, and anybody who isn't in that group is bad, and therefore they need to be punished and scapegoated and attacked and denigrated. That's what we need to look out for. And I think Nietzsche was opposed to that because he was already seeing what was happening as the German Empire was getting underway and the kind of stupid bigotry that was going on with that. He was invited to Bayreuth for the opera house there when Wagner started up. He kind of had this break with Wagner, so they really weren't talking to it, but he got an invitation anyway to go to this, to the great inaugural opera, and there was going to be this big revival of German culture, and he shows up, and there's all these dumb Prussian imperialists who are there being snobs. And as the opera started, Nietzsche became physically nauseous at the racists that were around him. And he had to get up and he had to leave. He had to leave the show. He couldn't stay. Yeah. Okay. That's the kind of attitude that I think is valuable coming from Nietzsche's philosophy and that Crowley's picking up on, and that this is useful for us. This is useful for us today, I think.
Yeah, I think it was only through his step sister or something that more of the kind of right conservative parts of Nietzsche got even promoted, because she was really into that, and she kind of falsely promoted that aspect, which is because Nietzsche is so deep and wide in his philosophy that you can pick out these aspects,
sure,
and kind of pick and choose if you have a kind of negative, say,
if you have an agenda, right? And that's always, again, what's so important about skepticism, which is to be aware that everybody has a particular set of assumptions, and to make those assumptions conscious rather than unconscious. That for me, that's also part of the importance of a skeptical methodology, is that you're inquiring into the presumptions that people have, and then you're not just letting those be implicit, you're trying to make those explicit so that their rationality can also be, because if there's anything that can be said about racism, it's that it's irrational from a pragmatic, not a metaphysical point of view. In fact, it is a kind of metaphysics. It's creating a metaphysical essentialism around this mythologized category called race that doesn't exist, is a social construct. And but it's reifying that and saying, no, this is the truth. And skepticism is corrosive of those kinds of ideas. And that's the way Crowley and Nietzsche want us to think, is to be aware of these presuppositions, because part of the way to solve the puzzle of the true will is to figure out, is to analyze what our cognitive framework, our pre-assumptions are, and then to reseed that with better ideas. And then we begin to act on assumptions that we've put there that are more coherently, pragmatically rational. Again, when I say rational, I'm not appealing to any universal reason. I'm saying in an immediate historical contextual sense, as participants in a social world around us that has a concrete, specific form. There's responses to that that make sense, and responses to that that don't make a lot of sense. Racism, for example, being one of those. So if we can kind of reseed our assumptions in a way that's more coherent, then that begins to answer the puzzle of the true will, because then it's like in the ordeal of the nefesh. We have all these emotional responses that are inauthentic. And if we can reprogram those responses, we can make our behavior more optimal through almost a kind of neuro-linguistic programming practiced on ourselves, or to see Magick as a kind of self-therapy, for example, where we're recovering the unconscious narrative of how we got to have the particular subjectivity that we have, which in the present we just sort of show up with it. But if we can if we can reclaim the memory of how we got here, we can adjust or change our interpretation of that narrative in a way that we can change who we are in the present in a way that's helpful to us. And again, helpful not in some universal sense, what would that even be, but helpful to us as human beings existing historically in a present moment, trying to accomplish certain things, to live in a wholesome, honorable, coherent, creatively interesting way. So Magick then becomes a tool that we could. Does that address your question in any way?
Yeah, definitely. That makes me also think of something that I thought of, like with skepticism, the more modern viewpoint would also include the evolutionary aspect of looking at it as,
Sure.
Like we have these preconceived notions based on the evolutionary or the way we developed on this, like in this environment. And so taking that into consideration when
biological instincts that we've inherited cognitively from the fact that we're monkeys, and that now we live in this completely technologically enclosed space that separates us from the usual processes of natural selection in nature. And how we should evolve now becomes more creative, but also more ambiguous, because it's no longer tied to the sort of immediate survival needs in the same way. But we still respond, like our lizard brain still responds from that space. This sort of fight or flight, depending on, or these aggressive responses that we're always having to, how we're being respected or not. I mean, this is animal behavior. And
and
it's not that we, right. And it's not that we shouldn't then be animals, because we are animals, but we also exist in a completely virtual, artificial way that we could then find some new accommodation, perhaps, with these instincts that might be more useful. So we're not just getting in bar fights all the time, for example. Anyway, I want to we've got about 5 minutes, so I want to give time for one other question. If there's somebody else who hasn't spoken yet who wants to say something, ask me a question or make a comment. And Robert and Taryn, that includes you too. If you want to jump in towards the end here, if you have anything you want to say.
I'll just say that was brilliant. I'm enjoying this. Best class I've ever attended, to be honest. Thank you
Okay,
very much.
okay, great. Do you have anything in particular that you thought was useful in the class that you might want me to say a few things more about?
I think you show how skepticism can be used by the aspirant within the AA framework, and that's important. I mean, I don't know if you caught. I mean, I assume it was purposeful.
Yes, it's meant to be there implicitly.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
so thank you for making that explicit. Yes.
Yeah.
This is all about, what does Crowley mean when he says that he wants the AA methodology to be scientific? What does that mean? Well, there's a whole bunch of different ways you could mean that. You could, and what I think is interesting is that he does not mean it in a positivistic sense, meaning in the sense that Theosophy, for example, talks about what they're doing as occult science, or the way that eugenicists thought that race was a natural scientific category, for example. Crowley is wanting to get away from that type of scientism, but preserve a kind of experimental methodology that science has, and also a kind of empirical skepticism that derives ultimately from ancient skepticism. One of the ancient skeptics, their name was Sextus Empiricus, and they were a medical doctor. And it might seem that withholding judgment is a weird way to be a medical doctor as a procedure, but in fact, in ancient times, this kept you from killing your patients, because you wouldn't just accept certain healing medicines as being efficacious on authority. You would test them out and see if they worked or not, and if they didn't work, you wouldn't prescribe them. And that's what an empirical method meant for Sextus Empiricus, and why he was against dogmatism, because there were all these medical doctors killing people because they don't have a modern theory of chemistry, and so they don't really know medically, biologically, necessarily what they're doing in a modern sense. And so you have all these superstitious remedies that don't work, but people are proceeding on authority. And Sextus Empiricus, as a skeptic, is saying, no, don't do that. Instead, have an empirical methodology where you're scientific in a skeptical way, where you're testing things with experience, and then you're proceeding on that basis, and you're not jumping to dogmatic conclusions. And that's the kind of scientific method that Crowley is interested in magical practice. That he thinks is where, as a practitioner, you're going to get somewhere, and not necessarily the dead end that the Theosophists or the eugenicists or all these cults of science that grew up in the late 19th century that turned into these totalitarian dead ends. Whether that's the belief that Marxism was a science, and that the Soviet Union had this scientific method of history that just turns into this this prison camp nightmare. And so whether in politics or the idea that liberals had, that capitalism had a scientific basis, that classical liberalism was a science that had correctly described the correct form of political economy, that Karl Marx is like exploding with his theory and saying that that's totally wrong. Capitalism isn't scientific at all. It's based on the supply side economics is based on all of these metaphysical assumptions with regards to what value is in the market that we should be completely skeptical about. And so, you know, again, these are ways to be scientific without being scientistic, without treating scientific method as a way to arrive at dogmas, but instead using it as a way to be open to your experience so you could learn new things and come up with practical ways to relate to your circumstances that can optimize the good. Again, the good from a pluralistic perspective, not from the perspective of some kind of universal truth with a capital T, because what is that? It's a Crowley says that's the Kabbalistic zero. There is no such thing. Instead, there's this pluriverse that we're this star in an orbit in, where this unique experience, this unique perspective, surrounded by all this other unique diversity. And let's get down to the rich experience of encountering that diversity and seeing what we can make of it creatively. Anyway, it's about 3:30. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. And we're going to continue this with a look at allegoresis and metaphor. and how that changes from ancient time to modern times. And we're going to look at an interesting text by Porphyry about that you don't have to read, but it's up on the website. And feel free to check that out during the week if you have some time. And again, I'll just be picking out the important sections of that that we'll be looking at next week. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm going to log out.